Yep. Okay. Guten Abend. Welcome everyone to this presentation by Wera Hobhouse. Couple of points before we get started. This is being recorded for YouTube. So if you need to put any extra makeup on, please do so now. Everyone is muted from outset, nothing personal. If you at any stage want to ask any questions, if you could use the chat function at the bottom and send your question to everyone, and then Marie will be asking people to inviting people to ask their question, and so we can get them all grouped. Basically, we're trying to make the best use of the time. No speeches, please, apart from Wera, obviously, and no long, complicated questions. So, hopefully no one has got any questions about that lot. I shall now, it's my pleasure to introduce Wera Hobhouse, who is over there, as you can see. Like me, Wera is a child of the 60s, and probably like me, she doesn't remember very much of it at all. But one very interesting little detail about Wera is, like the British royal family, she is a Hanoverian, which we don't hold against her. That's the royal connection bit anyway. What is mildly curious is that she did stand in northeast Somerset at one stage, so she had to deal with the buffoon Rees-Mogg. Perhaps we'll have some questions about that. Anyway, Wera, welcome to Lewisham. Please say your piece for 10 minutes and then everyone will pile in with their questions.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your welcome, Mark. Yes, I am from Hanover. I've actually moved around a little bit. I lived in Liverpool for nearly 10 years. We spent 15 years in Rochdale, where I was a councillor, and then my last bit is in Bath, and obviously I'm now sharing Bath and London. So actually I enjoy having moved around and seen lots of different parts of the UK, and that is actually part of my pitch as well. I think when you want to represent a whole party, it's important to understand where different people are coming from, and that different areas are responding to political challenges in a different way, and having had experience of living and also being politically active in different areas of the UK, I think is important. For me, local government is extremely important. I've been a local councillor for 10 years and have been longer in local government than having been an MP. And we will probably through this evening talk about this, how important for me local government is, and how I believe the future of our party very much depends on how we are starting to really take local government and winning locally seriously, and go away from a centralized structure of a party and centralized campaigning in order to give our local areas the best way of flourishing. And because we are passionate believers of local government, and I'm right behind everybody who has done local council work as a councillor, is a local activist. I was disappointed in 2010 when we all said, or when the party said, oh, for the first time in 70 years we are in government, and yet we had run many councils very successfully and had done a lot of government work and a lot of fantastic work at local level, and we continue to actually do a lot of fabulous work at local level, and we need to value that and enhance that and win from the bottom up. That's one part of my pitch, and I'm the only one of the three candidates who are standing who have that local government experience, and I think that is incredibly important and valuable. As I said, I think it's important to have the experience from not just one area of the UK, but understand, in my case, severely deprived areas of Rochdale and what is left behind, what some people call left behind areas or held back areas. Now I'm representing an affluent constituency in Bath, And it's important to have experienced that. I was representing actually a semi-rural ward in Rochdale, while I'm now in a very much an urban area. So, you know, a lot of things where I think the diversity of the party is something that I understand well. And I understand well that we cannot, one size doesn't fit all. I believe that we need to firmly cut or get away from our association with the coalition government. I was one of the many people who sat in Birmingham in 2010 and voted for the coalition and the coalition agreement. But I think in hindsight, we need to recognize that we now ended up with the most right-wing government in many decades, a government that has delivered Brexit and austerity. And we have to recognize that some of the responsibility of where we are now politically in the UK, we should take responsibility for that, not in a nasty way, but saying, look, it is time that we really cut our ties with the coalition, and we need a candidate that really is no longer associated with the coalition government. I was myself surprised how the coalition came back at Jo, and I supported her, I voted for her, but during the general election, it was one of the things that hang around our necks, and we need to make a firm break with the coalition government. That's another reason why I want to stand. And then the last one, I always say I'm a hard liberal. Mark has already mentioned, I was brought up in Hanover in Germany. I became politically aware, not in the 60s, because obviously, as Mark says, I don't remember anything from the 60s, but I started to become politically aware in the mid-1970s, big politically overshadowed by the 1968 student movement, but basically student politics was very, very left-wing. And at that point, the threat to liberalism came from the left. But we need to recognize that the threat to liberalism comes from the right now. And I believe that we need to respond with that with some firmness, rather than just being liberal about it with a small L. We need to recognize that if we are not careful, our liberal democracies and our liberal values are going to be undermined and destroyed. And you know, how we, as a tolerant party, do we respond to intolerance is a very difficult issue and subject. And of course, we don't want to become intolerant along the way. But I think to be too tolerant in the face of intolerance is a big threat. So we need to be firm in what we believe and stand up for what we believe firmly, and pick the people that we work with. And while we are talking about cooperation with all parties, we always like that. We should make sure that we are not somewhere in some sort of center of all parties, and we can work with everybody. But we are standing with both feet in the progressive left, and we are fighting the right. And the next general election is about to beat the Tories. And the Tories are the most right-wing Tory party and government that we've seen in a long time. So we need to be firm about this, and I'm up for a fight. That's as much as I want to say in my first 10 minutes, and I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Okay, so
sorry about that, Mark. I muted myself and then failed to unmute myself properly. We're going to ask everyone to put questions on the group chat, but Vera, I had a starter question, which was, how is your call for a progressive alliance going down with other parties? Have you had any, albeit informal, feedback?
Well, the main thing is that we as a party are clear what we want to do. And obviously, when I put out my piece about a progressive alliance, it was in a very lively fashion discussed amongst Liberal Democrats. And generally, it's the feedback is positive, because our heart beats on the centre left. We are a progressive party. We believe in social justice. We believe in international and international human rights, in civil liberties. We look at the climate emergency as a threat. actually to global inequalities, and that's why we are so passionate about wanting to fight it. We believe in good public services. We believe in a regulated state to curb the worst excesses of businesses and to protect the most vulnerable. So where we come from is from the progressive left anyway. So we don't have to make too many bones about where our values are. We are naturally on the left, and we should not be shy about fighting from the left. Yes, we have been experimenting with working together with the Tories, but if you look at what has happened, you know, the Tories used us cynically to destroy us in 2015. So our friends have put us in a position where we were nearly destroyed in 2015, and it becomes more difficult to defend what has actually come out of it. So for me, one of the things that could have come out of it, or should have come out of it, it was our long-term ambition for voting reform, but even that the coalition government didn't deliver. And again, these are all the sort of things that where we are standing together with other centre-left parties. So why do we not recognize that that's where we are as a party? We are really we are a centre-left party. We are never somewhere in the middle. We have experimented with that, but I don't believe it worked. And I think most people who are now members of the Liberal Democrats are recognizing that too.
We've got a question from Stephen Locke about how we distinguish ourselves from Labour. Stephen, do you want to ask your question now?
Well, my question is self-evident, really, but the election of Keir Starmer as Labour leader has quite clearly changed the Labour Party almost beyond recognition. It's now being reflected not only with Keir himself, but with the shadow cabinet and with the officials that are now leading at Labour Party headquarters. And a lot of that, I think you could describe as centre-left. The Labour left hates to hear that, but that's broadly where they seem to fit in. How do we maintain the Liberal Democrats' distinctiveness from that Labour agenda and from the culture of the Labour Party, whilst at the same time delivering on the fight against the Tories?
It's a very good question. And indeed, I think we shouldn't be afraid that we don't distinguish ourselves enough from the Labour Party. First of all, because the Labour Party has got a different leader now doesn't mean that the whole party has changed. But we have got very different political instincts. So we believe passionately in individual freedoms and civil liberties. We don't have the same authoritarian tendencies that the Labour Party has. We are firm believers in local democracy, local government, and grassroots politics and grassroots activism. And you know, the way we are looking, for example, at solving the climate emergency, which I think will be at the center of how we actually formulate liberalism and progressiveness going forward in the next 10 years. What is our response to the climate emergency? And if you look at what we are proposing, it's much more, apart from getting to net zero as a target, it is much more how do we get there? We actually believe in enterprise. I believe in enterprise. I don't believe that the public sector is everything and the private sector is nothing. Of course, we need to work with the dynamism, with the energy of private enterprise, of ideas, of the energy from the private sector. But in differentiations to the Tories, we believe in good regulations. That was one of the reasons why, for example, the right-wing Tories hate Europe so much, because it is about state regulation in order to intervene in the market. But we do believe in the market and market mechanism also to tackle the climate emergency. So we've got a lot of things where we are different from the Labour Party. We don't look at everything in terms of the class war. You know, there are lots of remnants of the Labour Party where everything is set up as a sort of class argument. We believe in every individual. We believe in the right of every individual to have a good life, and never one to the expense of the other. So in terms of values, we are very different from the Labour Party, but we have currently share more with the Labour Party than we share with the Tory Party.
We've got a couple of questions. Thank you, Wera, about how we'd win back areas such as Rochdale, and also about risking our strong position against rural Tories. So I'll start with Josh Curtis Hale. You had a question for Wera on after her experience in Rochdale and Bath.
Yes, hello everyone. So I think you represented Rochdale, is that right, as a councillor, and then obviously represent Bath now as an MP. I think we did hold Rochdale as a seat a few years ago now. I just sort of wondered sort of how you sort of plan to win back areas such as Rochdale, sort of areas predominantly in the north of England that may have voted for Brexit, and sort of what the plan was, whether that's sort of maybe at this point in time slightly too optimistic, or if you sort of have a plan in place to try and win back those areas.
So the general election review, which I recommend, it's a good read, almost like a Crimea, so page turner. So Dorothy Thornhill has done really well. Comes back with a number of recommendations. First, she says we basically sat on the fence, and sometimes in politics you have to choose between two unenviable positions. So she talked about we should have either accepted Brexit, or if we wanted to fight Brexit, we should have done that, recognizing we could only win with the Tories. But what she also said is we cannot assume that we win parliamentary seats out of the blue. We only win these seats where a lot of local groundwork has happened. So where we have won council seats and where we are a strong local presence, and from there we can win more national seats again. And I think firmly that that's how we have to go. And I said in my opening pitch, I believe in local government, local activism, local campaigning, and local parties know best how they can win. And a lot of Liberal Democrat seats in the past we have won actually on very local issues. So let's go back to basics, and let's go back to the grassroots. And yes, it's been incredibly difficult. And I was sitting in Rochdale in 2010 when at each election we lost a third, because we were voting in thirds. Each election we lost a third of our councillors and went from 32, which was the majority out of 60 councillors, to 1 councillor at some point. So very gradually clawed that back. And for that reason too, it is very important to firmly cut with a coalition government, but also recognize that austerity, whether we like it or not, just cause such damage in areas like the north. You know, I sat there and had to see that my colleagues in the south were agreeing to the bedroom tax, which was one of the most cruel and cynical things to do. Where we win, where we recognize our local strength, and we need to give the freedom to our local parties in different areas to actually fight elections on their own terms, rather than having a centralized message that can often be very destructive to local messaging. And yes, I recognize, of course, we need to have an overarching message of who we are as Liberal Democrats. But I think you know, we have made many mistakes of being too centralized and sending out centralized messages that it simply didn't work for local areas. And I think we need to be much more aware of that and being looser in what we prescribe from the center, and allow local parties to make their own luck. And to be quite honest, areas like Rochdale are a bit similar, like areas like Cornwall and Devon. They come from a very sort of independent tradition. The further away you are from London, actually, the more you really believe in liberalism is also about just being independent, have your own idea, and in fact, local councils are demonstrating that time and again, where they're run by Liberal Democrats. They have got good ideas, evidence, ideas, local solutions that are about their local area and how you respond about that. So I'd say, in one short word, our way of winning back is localism, and we are champions of local government and local democracy and local government. Let's win back from the grassroots up and give local councils the freedoms to shape their own fortunes as Liberals.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Michael Fox, which is one about risking our second place strong position against rural Conservatives. Michael.
Hi, Vera, thank you. So obviously our list of second place seats is largely in sort of more rural seats in the south of England. And I'm concerned that by actively moving to the left, we might risk our chance and scare off some of those Tory moderate voters who the election review said might have been scared of a more left-wing government anyway. And is that a concern, and do you have a strategy to deal with it if it is?
Well, first of all, I mean, let's go a little bit back to when we actually had our best electoral fortunes, and that was under Paddy Ashton and Charlie Kennedy. And it worked very well. And as long as the progressive left doesn't consistently split themselves, we can actually win. But what did we do in the last election to split the progressive left and let the Tories slip through? Fair enough, this election was about Brexit, and in some seats the Tories just won an outright 50% majority, but that's not usually the case, and it was very unusual, and it was about Brexit. And let's wait and see how Brexit plays itself out. And you can already see the angst of a lot of farmers and fishermen definitely around the southwest who are recognizing that actually the Tories are not delivering on their promises of what Brexit will actually bring. So, and for that reason alone, I was a passionate anti-Brexit campaigner, but I think currently we just need to let the whole thing play itself out. And in 2 or 3 years' time, a lot of people will wake up to the broken promises, and then people will rediscover their independent. Their independent instincts, and we Liberal Democrats always represent at best. I mean, we did actually quite well in many seats where we were gaining back when in 2017 the Labour Party had become second. We got second again, and as long as we recognise together with the Labour Party and have at least informal pacts that the Labour Party doesn't fight us and we don't fight the Labour Party, where we are either party in the second position against the Tories, we have to be. Then I do believe we can win. In most seats, it's very clear where we are second against the Tories, and that's usually in the sort of, as you say, the rural south. But in the industrial north, it's the Labour Party who is up against the Tories, and we need to just not fight each other. That in itself will probably help a great deal. We have really made a foolish mistake fighting each other in the last general election, and we fired far too much fire at Corbyn. Yes, of course, we said, some soft Tories who might support us might be scared of. You know what? By the time it came to the general election, people were either anti-Brexit and there were no longer Tories, or there were Tories. There was no such thing as Tories who were anti-Brexit. It didn't exist anymore. And any election polling during any pre-polling always showed that the most difficult people to shift were actually the Tories. They might say, I have nearly voted Liberal Democrats because I don't really like Brexit. But in the end, they vote Tory. Well, then they were happy with Brexit. And we need to recognize that. It wasn't true. People who were anti-Brexit had to be also at some point anti-Tory. If they didn't come over, they were never with us anyway.
We have to put sweet corn. It's in a can. It's in a can. Yeah.
Thanks, Vera. We've got a couple of questions about COVID coming up from Janet and sustainable ways of living. Janet, how can we get back to more sustainable ways of living after COVID? And then there's one from Sammy Dorgam about artificial intelligence and technology change. But Sammy, you've also asked if how we can, the UK can be a world leader and ensure people can adapt to a new labour market.
Yeah, so hi Vera, thank you, really good talk. One of the big changes that is happening right now is the impact of artificial intelligence and technology change, and it will have huge implications on the way that we live, on the jobs market, and all ways of life. What are your sort of key policies to make sure that we can be a leader in that globally and to sort of set the sort of standard globally? And also to make sure that people who potentially lose their jobs in the future are able to retrain and move into new positions.
And Janet, I think this might relate to your question about sustainable living as well.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm really concerned about the environmental impact of the COVID crisis, in that we are producing all this single-use plastic in the form of PPE. We're being encouraged to use disposable items rather than reusable ones. And we're also being encouraged to get back into our cars if we don't ride bikes, so as not to use public transport. As our environmental spokesperson, how would you suggest we get people back to a more sustainable way of living when this is over?
Let me respond to the second question first. There's actually, the picture is a little bit more sort of differentiated. Because we are locked down in our homes, a lot of CO2 has actually been not released into the atmosphere because of the vast amounts of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere via our travel habits. So the biggest challenge, as you just said, is that people, once the COVID crisis is over, although doesn't seem to be over anytime soon, will jump back into their cars because they're trying to avoid public transport. And we have, as Liberal Democrats, councillors and council groups and council leaders, and myself as a spokesperson, have written a number of letters and lobbied government in order to make sure that the increased walking and cycling that you can see across our certainly urban areas is going to be maintained. And you can see some physical changes in London where, for the first time, actually, and I'm a cyclist, I find that cycling becomes a lot more pleasant because actually bollards are properly put up, cyclists are properly separated from cars. So safer cycling is definitely happening. And the widening of pavements in Bath, the suggestion of actually restaurants and bars, certainly during the summer month, can put our tables and make sure that we are taking more of the road space and integrating it more into space to use by pedestrians. And the joy of that and the much improved urban spaces is definitely something that people notice, recognize, and hopefully will be able to take into the future. And where we have Lib Dem councils, I know from my own council, which is Lib Dem run, that we are definitely trying very hard to take that into the future and see it as a springboard in order to make road space for motorists more reduced and work towards, in a city like Bath, towards a city centre free of motorists, and take that from there then also into our local centres. People have recognised that actually there is a great value, and Marianne and I, we talked about the fly that was sharing my flat with me tonight, and how we have discovered and seen nature and look at insects and look at birds and hear the birds again. These sort of things that we also recognise as being very valuable for our mental health, I think are definitely things that we can point towards and get public buy-in, because that's often the most difficult thing for change, is that people just don't believe that there's any benefit. But now we can demonstrate through the COVID crisis that actually there are lots of benefits about being more connected to nature again, seeing really the damage of cars, not just because they're dangerous for our safety, but also because they're noisy. I mean, there's a lot of things that is not great about cars, and gradually moving people towards enjoying different forms of transport other than jumping into the car. I think we are sort of getting there, but it's quite true that currently we are using a lot of single-use items, and that is frankly about regulations that we are putting in place for single-use plastics. And there's actually stuff that is coming even through the Tory government now, where we are banning single-use plastics. We need to have much clearer policies and guidance from central government how we get to net zero. And that brings me then to talk about our plans how to get to net zero. But that goes slightly too far in order to answer your question. But just one thing, we have very clear policies of how we get to net zero. If you want to get to net zero, and you need political will, we as Liberal Democrats have a very clear plan. The government doesn't. So what do? We obviously need to hold the government to account, but also make sure at the next general election people clearly understand that the government is doing very little to tackle the climate emergency, and for that reason alone, we should vote them out. And about artificial intelligence, I know where this discussion is going to go, and that is whether I support universal basic income. Because that's very often put together now as an argument, because we are the job or labour market of the future will not provide enough for everybody to actually have a job. First of all, I'm not necessarily that gloomy about the future and future jobs markets. I think every generation was becoming very worried. You know, when the Luddites, I think they were called. You know, when automation was coming along, people thought, oh God, you know, we might not have enough jobs. I'm not quite sure whether that is really what is going to happen with artificial intelligence. First of all, again, because we talked about the difference between Labour and the Lib Dems, we are actually finding the new technologies in the future quite exciting. What do we do? And embracing new technologies and a new future. What do we do about making sure that people can retrain? I think the far more interesting idea, rather than UBI, but I'm happy to see what people actually mean by UBI, so universal basic income. What I find far more attractive is something that Vince Cable put out there as for a lifelong learning budget. So that particularly young people at a particular age, at age 16, you're leaving formal education, and then you're being given amount of money that you can spend over your lifetime in education and training. Whether you decide to first at 16 go and have a job, and then maybe after 2 or 3 years time go back into training, or whether at 35 you want to retrain and have a different job. So for me, the best idea around UBI or some form of UBI would be actually what Vince suggested already, a year or two ago, about a lifelong training budget. And I think that is something that we Liberal Democrats should take very seriously and develop further as an idea for Liberal Democrats.
Thank you. I have a question now from Joyce Onstad, who wants to know about your foreign policy.
That's a long foreign policy. So my very
Joyce, do you want to
specify a little bit? Yeah, I mean, obviously we Liberal Democrats, we were anti-Brexit. I was one of the most passionate anti-Brexit campaigners. We have to recognise that the fight to stop Brexit, we have lost it. But that doesn't mean that we should give up on our long-term vision and our long-term hope that we will once again be part of the European project. Because I believe not only, and there's always my argument, not only are we going to lose out, but so does the European Union. We should be at the heart of the European project. And while it would not be good politics to advocate for European membership next year, we should never forget to keep the flame alive of that's where we should be, at the center of the European project. And I had an interesting discussion with the Swiss ambassador during the last autumn conference, and he said to me, in the 1990s, the Swiss voted to not become members of the European Union. They obviously do this referendum thing all the time. And since then, no major political party has ever mentioned again whether actually Switzerland should become a member of the European Union. And therefore, Switzerland is in this strange position of having many, many bilateral agreements, basically following the European Union in everything, without having a proper say in it, which is obviously one of the arguments we put forward as well. But that's basically where Switzerland is stuck, because no political party has taken it upon themselves to say, look, we should be a pro-European party. And I think, and the Swiss ambassador said this to me like this, the Liberal Democrats should have this historic mission to not give up on European membership at some point in the future. And that's basically where I stand. Should we ask for a transition, for expansion of the transition period? Yes, of course, any opportunity to sort of keep us aligned with the European Union is of course to be called for. but really we should be clear that an extension of the transition period is not membership. So that's my position about Europe. Of course, let's wait and see where Europe is going. But membership of the European Union and the dream that we, or the ambition, the fire that we want to be members of the European Union for all the reasons that we have played out throughout the 2.5 or 3 years of anti-Brexit campaigning, we shouldn't suddenly give up on that. And there's a pent-up frustration within the Remain movement, which I'm very closely aligned to. Bath for Europe was one of the most passionate campaigners, and I'm sure the Bath berries, they were created on the kitchen table of my friend Maggie. Yeah, we were anti-Brexit campaigners, and I won't give up on the idea that once again we will be members of the European Union. On a wider context, we see the rise of China. What are we going to do with our relationship with China? I think we have seen over the last month, particularly, that the criticism against China and the way the Chinese are trying to destroy Hong Kong and its once state, two systems, and the brutality that we have seen of the Chinese regime against the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement has alarmed many Western democracies. So standing with Hong Kong, one of the things that should be led by the Liberal Democrats, and with Paddy Ashton, again, a firm friend of the people of Hong Kong. I think we're in a very good position as Liberal Democrats to make that case, warn against our involvement with Huawei and the reliance of Britain on Chinese money and Chinese products. We should become very aware of and become less naive about China. My stance towards the US and Trump, the Trump US should be pretty clear from what I stand for. The US is not Trump, but currently I think we should be very critical about Trump's US or Bolsonaro's Brazil. I have said the threat to liberalism comes from the right, so tendencies in other countries where they're lurching to the right, we should just be very firm about that, and we should be very firm about where we are supporting governments with our arms trades like Saudi Arabia, which are being used in wars in Yemen. So these are sort of broad themes. Make sure that we just don't make foul compromises with regimes because we think that we are dependent on their money or on their fossil fuels or on a perceived friendship that is no longer there, like in the US currently.
Thank you. We've got a question from Afzal Munna. Afzal, you were asking about our strategy and actions with regards to COVID. We were silent and suddenly became very vocal on Black Lives Matter. Afzal, do you want to put your question to Wera?
Yeah, hi, Wera. This is Afzal from New Embarking in Dagenham. Well, I had that opportunity to visit your office actually, because I love Bath. Is kind of like my second place. I'm doing my PhD at University of Bath, so that allows me to go and visit your nice city. If I had to move from London, that is going to be Bath. So just to let you know, I like that much. My question, yes, we haven't seen any highlighted peoples like one of like you, let's say, for example, or others, in those who are in the strategy making part of the party. We haven't seen anybody talking about COVID-19 strategy. There was no guidelines as a opposition's party, apart from we just every day listen to Boris and his people. We haven't got anything from the party. And suddenly, due to these George Floyd's death in US, our LDCRE wing from the party has become very vocal about Black Lives Matters. So, I mean, as a young liberal, I actually kind of like confused sometimes that why we are so divided in between us, why we cannot be united ourselves first before we make any massive move.
So can you, I'm not entirely certain whether I quite understood what you're saying is, you say that originally we were very silent on the government strategy on COVID, and now suddenly we become very vocal against the way the government is dealing with COVID. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, these are two different topics. One was that we haven't seen as a party to have any actions on COVID-19. So why was that? That was my first question. And the second one is that we have a wing of LDSE in between with our Liberal Democrats Party, is the equality parties. We haven't seen them either talking about COVID-19, but they suddenly become very vocal about Black Lives Matters.
Right, so I share your frustration about us not being more vocal in our opposition of how the government was handling the COVID-19 crisis, and that's about who is our leader. And I mean, I wouldn't stand for leadership if I didn't think we could do better. I know Ed is our acting leader, and he feels that he's neither here nor there until he becomes a real leader. But I think from the leadership, from his leadership, could have come a lot more criticism from the very beginning of how the COVID crisis was handled by this government, because I felt from the very beginning that it was a very right-wing response to a pandemic. And it was guided by something that the Tory party doesn't want to talk about anymore, but herd immunity. So a little bit this sort of survival of the fittest idea. Yes, a few vulnerable people and some elderly people will die, but in order to keep the economy going, we won't do lockdown, we won't do any of these draconian measures that we have seen in China, and then as they happen in European countries as well. And some of that Brexit bravura about we can do this differently in Britain, and that possibly the COVID virus would behave differently in Britain, has led to the fact that we were locking down far too late. And to be quite honest, I mean, I can prove that to you in internal messaging that we've got a WhatsApp group where we talk to each other about what we think we should do. I've said, look, why don't we say this? Why aren't we going much harder as an opposition against what the government is doing? Why didn't we say at the time we should have locked down earlier? And you know, there was this reluctance from my colleagues to be critical about the government because they thought, oh, they're advised by scientific advisors. And I said, look, there are scientific advisors, and it comes out now, there are scientific advisors, but they're only advice. And in the end, the decisions are political. And if the decisions are political, we can criticize them. And there was in my Lib Dem group this thing, oh, but they're advised by the scientists, so that must be right. Rather than understanding that scientists themselves were divided amongst themselves. And clearly it was political decisions to keep the economy going as long as possible. And no progressive government would have responded in that way, because we value all lives equally, and we would have looked at the protection of the vulnerable far more early than this government has done. And I would have loved us Liberal Democrats to go in there and say that, but I'm not the leader of the Liberal Democrats. So that's my response to the first question. About our diversity and what we are saying about Black Lives Matters, and also what we are saying about all the evidence that is coming out that ethnic minority communities are much harder hit by COVID. I think, again, we could be a lot more vocal to say, we want a proper investigation why this happens. I think it becomes clearer and clearer the reason why that happens is not a genetic reason, but because a lot of people from ethnic minorities work in less well-paid jobs, weren't furloughed, had to continue to go to work, were more exposed to the virus and the danger of the virus, and they were disadvantaged in that way. And that's to do with endemic disadvantage of ethnic minority groups and from all backgrounds, and that's why where it is. But we absolutely need that inquiry to make sure we fully understand why there's this disproportionate loss of life in ethnic minorities. There's one other thing that I would like to say, and I said at the beginning, I've lived in different areas of this country. So in Bath, it's a very white community, but Rochdale had a big ethnic minority. And the incidence of racism in Rochdale, where I was a councillor, where my children were brought up, were just much lesser because people had learned to live with different communities together, and you were in London, and we know that actually anti-immigration and hate against foreigners and all that sort of stuff is much lower where people live in mixed communities. But we have still very, very white communities, and Bath is one of them. I think it's a problem. It's a problem that we think that we've already tackled racism. We put in every classroom, we abhor racism, but we don't really understand what it feels like for people who are growing up with a different skin color, what discrimination is really like. And that discussion we don't have honestly enough, and that discussion we didn't have and don't really have in the party. And maybe the Black Lives Matter movement, or uprising if you wish, is a good opportunity for us as a party to also have an honest discussion why we are still very much a white party and why we probably still haven't really understood what racism is.
Thank you. We've got a question now from Alastair Mitton on the relationship between activists and the centre. Alastair.
Thank you. Thank you, Vera. I was a campaign manager in a stretch target seat at the general election, and I was absolutely horrified at the frankly toxic relationship between activists and the centre. I had senior activists coming to me virtually in tears from the bullying that they received, coming from other parts of the campaign, dragging them off and away from our campaign, which could have been entirely legitimate. But it was really the culture of bullying and toxic relationship, a feeling of entitlement that apparently the centres had towards people who were paying to volunteer. Now, as leader, it will be down to the leader to change the tone, change the culture, and make it the kind of family that I think really all of us would like to be part of. So how would you go about changing that tone and changing that culture?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. First of all, it needs to be recognised that something is somewhat rotten in that relationship between the centre and local parties. And I said at the beginning, I think we need to recognise that we have got it wrong. I think the election review actually recognises that, and it's obviously for the next leader to implement the changes that have actually been recommended. And I think the party's ultimately on board with that. But of course, your heart has to be really with it. And again, I think, so just from my history, as I have explained it at the beginning, I was a local councillor. I have been campaigning and working politically in different areas of the United Kingdom. I probably understand the need for that much better than the other candidates. And my heart is really with that change. And I'm very, very sorry to hear what you have just described. And I'm not surprised. When seats become target seats, the centre swoops in and takes over entirely, to the huge frustration of local activists, local councillors, local party workers. And it happened to me in Bath. You know, I was basically just the candidate and put on a sort of chair. And I said, hang on, I've been campaigning for 10 years. I've got some ideas of how you win a campaign. You come in here and you're telling me how I'm going to win. You did win, it's fine. But in this latest general election, again, we had designed 3 good leaflets that we wanted to deliver throughout the election campaign. The whole of Bath was showered with rubbish, if I may say, literature from the centre, to the point that my local activists didn't want to deliver my leaflets. And that absolutely has to change. And that has to change because you have understood and recognized that real damage that is being caused if we don't give local parties, local activists the freedoms and also the resources, because that's obviously, that goes with it. And how we organize that in detail. How do we actually devolve more resources to the regions and the local parties rather than holding that that money centrally when it comes to general elections, but also releasing more money for local elections so we can fight hard for local elections rather than always retaining all that money just for general elections. I think that's where we could start making a change.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we may get through all the questions. Otherwise, I think, Vera, will you be able to answer them on the website? Is that the best thing to do? If we can't quite get through them.
I have said everything is now online, and when I first thought about standing for the leadership, I thought, let's just do a very good online campaign. And I know that the problem is that not everybody in the party is digitally, but we've learned a lot, actually, and a lot of people, even older people, can now do the Zoom thing, and I think we shouldn't actually be so dismissive. I think it is good that we are trying to do a completely online campaign, and I'm actually quite well set up for it. So I was proud about my website and the way we've set it up, and I'm putting more pieces on the website. So please go and visit my website, www.werahobhouse.org.uk. Lots of what I'm standing for will be on there. And I try to make it as interesting as possible, putting new stuff on there. So hopefully you'll find some more answers if you go to my website.
Thank you. And this is one from James about having a Hanoverian Prime Minister. James, are you? Is James here to put your question?
Huh? Hang on. I don't hear the question. James.
As Liberals, says James, we are absolutely fine with having a leader of foreign descent. But how will you deal at the election with people who say we couldn't possibly have a foreign Prime Minister?
Well, let's face it. And I think, I am not a leader who's going to stand and says, I'm going to be the next Prime Minister. That was a message that just didn't sit with me at all. In fact, it emerged during the hustings, and Ed Davey first came up to it with it. And he had his first hustings in Bath, and there was Jo who was talking about Jo and Jo and a movement she wanted to create. And then Ed stood up and said, you could be looking at the next Prime Minister. I thought it was just not right. And I'm not going to stand to stay here and say, I'm going to be the next Prime Minister. I'm not. Let's understand where we stand as a party in a two-party system, and being the third party and currently a long way behind. It's going to be long, meticulous work until we're actually getting back to the successes that we had in the early noughties. So let's just put our eyes on winning locally, making sure that we win as many local councils again, but just not have this sort of pompous idea that any leader of the Liberal Democrats could become the next Prime Minister. That is just wrong. I'm not standing on that ticket, and therefore I don't think that that question will ever be asked of me. I will want to lead a successful Liberal Democrats that is going back to the levels of support that we had between 2000 and 2010, or from the 1997 onwards, that is basically based on local support. I want lots of local council leaders. Those are the guys that might come from Hanover or not, but it doesn't matter. But that is where I'm focusing my energy on. It's not about me. It's about the fortunes of the party and how I support you and your local areas, your local council success. And yes, where we can win national seats, that's great, but we are not going to have suddenly 100 or 150 seats. It was a big failure of the last election campaign that we are building up this pompous idea that any leader of the Liberal Democrats could become the next Prime Minister. Let's not go that way. I'm not going that way.
Thank you. We're coming now to almost 8 o'clock. Vera, you've got other commitments. Mark, I'll pass back to you to thank Vera.
Yep, indeed. Yes, thank you very much, Vera. I have to say that as we have a tax Coburg monarch, I have no idea why we would have a problem with a Hanoverian Prime Minister, but I do take your point, but perhaps it's a bit premature for that. Thank you very much for your contribution this evening. This session was set up by, in part, by Lewisham Liberal Democrats, and I am the treasurer of Lewisham Liberal Democrats, and I like counting money. So we have been asking people to make a donation for entirely spurious reasons, because obviously we're not paying for this technology or anything. If you do get the urge to make a donation, I've sent a link to our website and the donation page on it. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. And there is, on your reactions icon at the bottom of your screen, there is a little waving hand thing. So I'd invite you to clap in appreciation of Vera's contribution this evening, and I shall be clapping for your financial contribution. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me, and very well chaired and compared, Marion and Mark, and thanks so much. And hopefully we see each other again soon physically. But in the meantime, have a good evening, and thank you again. Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Vera. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks for excellent questions and excellent answers.